which also explores the idea of multitude, but from a different perspective. Just now, in the panel that Kate Fowle moderated, I was talking about multitude in terms of artistic practice, in terms of potential relevance in society. And now it's a very, very similar conversation we're going to have, but just from a different perspective, the perspective of the relationship between institutions and their audience. And what does an audience constitute? Does it constitute a commons, or does it constitute a multitude? And to what end do institutions engage their audiences? The idea of engagement is very interesting because engagement has different potential in different contexts, and different possibilities in different cultural contexts, different meanings. So I'd like to introduce the panel. The moderator is Mr. Bart de Beer, who is director at MUCA in Antwerp, in Belgium. Back on the stage, as panelists, there are Kate Fowle, who I'll introduce again as director of the chief curator of the Garage Center of Contemporary Culture in Moscow and director at large at ICI in New York. Also back on stage is Jack Persekian, who is director of the Al Mamal Foundation in Jerusalem and head curator and director of the Palestinian Museum. New on the stage is Mr. Bartomeu Mari, who is director of MACBA in Barcelona, and Mami Kataoka, chief curator of the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo. And Mami is also a Multitude Art Prize partner curator, like Kate. So, welcome.
So I think we ended really nicely with the first debate and ending up with the question, relevant to who? And also what I really liked was the last remarks that went back and forth from Rax to Sarai, sort of. The saying that potentiality seemed to be the good, which was then countered by saying that it's merely a new opening. Now we have more of the same at this moment, because I would say that notions of the multitude and the commons, they sort of are the hope or the kind of dream which the contemporary art world has been developing for the last 10 years. But we have to do more than that at this moment. Our question was, do audiences constitute a commons or a multitude? I think it may be good to dwell again on the notions. As Kate has been saying, there are notions that have been very diversely discussed, on which there is no clear definition. But the notion of the commons has been, you could say it's the common grounds of our society that cannot be privatized. It has been developed discursively, mainly starting from English pastures that were not belonging to anyone, but on anyone on which every person in the village could have their herds be fed. It has been started from a really concrete thing. On the other hand, the notion of multitude, which is here being referred to always in relation to the two names of Negri and Hart, whom sort of developed it into a kind of a revolutionary force that may express its own constituent project. But they themselves also refer to 17th century thinkers, and the main reference here is Baruch Spinoza. He's a 17th century Dutch philosopher who introduced the notion of multitudo. And multitudo to Spinoza, it's a plurality which persists as such in the public scene. So you have a community that is made up out of diversity. It's a very beautiful notion, and also in the way in which the operaist philosophers have developed this, they developed it in relation to another philosopher, an English philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, whom with his Leviathan, even if he also developed notions of the right of the individual, who advocated the absolutism of the sovereign, which is relating to a Europe in the 17th century that had been at war for a long time. The religious wars. So for Hobbes this was a solution. If we accept this, we will not have war anymore. And for Hobbes, what? If we accept that the sovereign has all the power, we agree to that, we will, that's I think the basic idea. And he actually sees this multitudo as anti-state, as resisting authority, and as not leading up to lasting agreements. And I think it's sort of important to go back to that because it's, I think, us being institutions, and each of you are responsible for institutions, we are not in this pristine state of Rights Media Collective. We are in a kind of very ambiguous in-between state, in which what Spinoza or Hobbes would call potestas, the power of the sovereign, is also something which we have to deal with. So before we go into the new opening, which is not necessarily a good, of the multitude, what I would really like is that each of you would reintroduce yourself, but in terms of the audiences you are representing. Audiences both in terms of what are they really, what's the real terms, in terms of what do your authorities, your sovereigns, want them to be, and how do you see them?
My name is Mami Kataoka. I'm from Mori Art Museum, and I had been with the museum for this particular museum for 10 years. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary. Yay! And because of the nature of the museum, which the entrance system is combined with this museum is on the 53rd floor, and then the entrance system is together with the observation deck. So we have a lot of audience coming to the contemporary art show. And last exhibition, a very controversial solo presentation of Makoto Aida, we had, in 4 months, we had 480,000 people came, which was crazy number for the contemporary art exhibition. But so in that nature, I always needed to consider what our audiences are. And just go back to the idea of a multitude. And I very much like to look at the idea of multitude as a horizontal model of the society or perception of the world, which the Zetenka mentioned. But also, I wanted to connect that model or perception of the world with the Eastern ancient thinking or perception, like idea of yin-yang, and then also the Wuxin, that maybe Chinese people knows. The Wuxin is how the entire universe is balanced with the conflict and supplement of different elements of the world, like fire, wood, water, metal, and soil. And that's all sometimes conflict, but sometimes supplement each other. And that's all on a horizontal model. And so that it really creates a new way of looking at how different components or the elements that conflict each other could also have well-balanced equilibrium. And so going back to the museum audience, we do have, within this like 500,000 people, there are so many different kinds of audience. And for instance, the nowadays museum has to be financially supported by the kind of wealthy layers of people who could give you some financial support for the museum. And particularly in the US museum, the people in a director or management level of the museum, they have to be always together with potential collectors or supporters or big group of the people who donate the work and financial support. But also, in this last exhibition, Makoto Aida, we tested the crowdfunding model and for the different kinds of audience, because we couldn't really get the corporate sponsor because of the very explicit nature of the art. So we did crowdfunding to kind of distribute $150 editions, and we were quite successful to get nearly 300,000 million sales, and which created $200,000 million, 200,000, not million, sorry. I lied. No, $200,000 income, which was very helpful as a new model. So that's why we are looking at different kinds of audience financially, but also as an exhibition experience. Of course, within this 500,000 people, there are people who just didn't know there was an art exhibition, just passing by and saw the show. And then also there are a real art audience. Probably I would assume that's 10%, but they would always come and see the contemporary art exhibition. But there are always people in between. So what do you serve to the audience is you can of course give them the exhibition experience. But the people, for instance, to buy the publication and read all these essays are more for the specific art audiences. And then also the different kind of public programs to provide additional information or to contextualize what you see is also a very important practice of the museum. And lastly, I wanted to mention the different audiences. For instance, when you do travel the show that you produced. For instance, I'm traveling Ai Weiwei retrospective or survey show in North America now. And so you're looking at different audience from either Japan or China and in North America. So what you do when you curate and when you make a presentation, how do you consider a different understanding of the different audience?
My name is Jack Persekian, and maybe in order to answer this question, I need to rewind back to more than 20 years ago when I started working in the field, and realizing that there are challenges to the whole idea of audience and exposure and what art needs to do in this context, and that in the context that I was working with in Palestine then, and mainly the fact that it's a place under siege, it's a place completely disconnected from the world, which had a kind of adverse effect on the art that is produced and its capability to basically carry the message that it's trying to project to the world about the state of things in Palestine. So my idea was to try to find ways to break out of the state of siege and find ways and means to connect with the outside world, creating through that small project that I started with a sort of window to the outside world where people from the outside can see what's happening inside and people from the inside can basically engage and interact and learn from what's happening outside. And that over years, I think have had a great impact on the art scene in Palestine and have gave it some kind of leverage in terms of its presence and in terms of its impact on society. Moving to a completely different context, when I decided that I personally do not need to be stuck within that national geography, and try to go out and see how my role could play out in a different context, where I started working in the Gulf states. And there the context had shifted in terms of audience from basically the idea of having events and projects that were primarily catering to basically how should I say, events and exhibits and kind of PR events, if I may call it this way, to promote the country and to promote the new kind of stage of openness and prosperity and development, and take that and shift it to become more of an institution, or of a program that could service and cater to the needs of the region in terms of providing means, providing facilities, providing platforms for connections and interaction with the outside world. So using the resources that were, as I mentioned earlier, abundant there, and transforming, for example, the Biennale that I was working for, from a kind of window display of art and art production to a kind of producer, to an institution that helped give grants, that helped provide means for artists, that created all sorts of programs of residencies, and made connections with other institutions, supporting partly their projects and collaborating with them and through them to basically disseminate the production that that is happening in the world, mainly in the Arab world. So in both cases, the audiences were the idea of an audience were very much connected to what are the needs and how one would perceive the situation in terms of a developmental context.
So, my name is Kate Fowle, and I'm going to talk from two different positions with my two hats on. So first of all, with Independent Curators International, of which I was the executive director for 4 years, and now I'm director at large, whatever that means. It's an institution that was started in 1975, and it is an institution without walls. That's how it was first described, or you could say it's an institution without a venue. Its remit was to work with curators to develop exhibitions that would travel to different places. So the audience was always absent from the heart of the institution, if you like. It was always an imagined audience. It's what Mami was talking about with what happens when you travel a show. How do you make relevance when there is no specific audience? So when I first started with ICI, I decided to stick my neck out and say that in order to produce relevance, I wanted to focus on one very particular audience, and that was the professional audience. So I decided that because of the fact that curating is still a very kind of new concept, really, in terms of contemporary curating, and this notion of what international means is still so confusing, how could you actually produce a scenario or a situation that could move and could be kind of flexible enough to allow professionals at all stages in their career to talk to each other? So with ICI, that's basically how the institution has developed over the last 3 or 4 years, thinking about how to actually become very, very specific to cater to a professional audience and what those needs are. With the other hat on, as chief curator of the Garage, I can tell you concept rather than reality. Or I can talk to you about hearsay, because I started on the 1st of April. The reason why I was employed is because the garage was started in 2008, and now the organisation wants to become an institution. So it's recognising the fact that it wants to kind of have some kind of, or build infrastructure. So in that respect, the notion of audience is about producing an audience. And by that, what is wanted there is, rather than a number of people coming to openings or coming to an exhibition, we want to create some kind of return audience, or some kind of loyalty or interest in coming back to a place that you can continue to engage with ideas, kind of develop your own way of thinking and interact with different perspectives that are offered to you. And so it's about a kind of regularity. Audience equals a regularity of visiting. It's also about empowerment, but this is something that I think is extremely kind of problematic, if you like. So the idea is that to produce an audience, you need to start to produce education and enable some kind of two-way street. So an audience is no longer the kind of the invisible face, but there's some kind of engagement with an audience so that the audience can be empowered. But what that actually means, I think, is something that really needs to be discussed. There's also what Jack was talking about, the kind of relationship of local, when you think about audience, to international. So when you start to develop an institution, you're of course wanting it to be relevant and speak to people outside of its location. So Garage wants to kind of relate to an audience outside of Moscow. But I suppose, if you like, part of my questioning at the moment is, how do we place somewhere like the Garage onto into an international dialogue and still make it something that local audiences can relate to? Or is there a difference between the two? I would say that there definitely is, but the word audience is still too broad. So maybe just to finish with kind of one more thought about that, this whole idea of creating an institution in relation to audience is what I've been charged with directly, is to make a program. So rather than a series of exhibitions that are often kind of received and put forth as a kind of statement, again, to kind of reiterate what you're saying, the idea of producing a program, of offering support for practitioners to produce. So the Garage becomes not a receiving house, but a producing house. I'll stop there.
Thank you. My name is Bartolomeu Maria, and I am the director since 2008 of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, MACBA, which is a consortium that brings together the City Council of Barcelona, the Catalan government, and a private foundation as the founding members of the consortium, to which in 2007 the Spanish Ministry of Culture also joined as a member of that institution. The public institutions, City Council, Catalan government and Ministry of Culture put money into the institution that pays for the operations. The MACBA Foundation brings funds for acquiring the works of art for its collection, and now they help us also. In finding sponsors and patrons for our activities. Now, MACBA is in the middle of a deep change that affects all of its constituencies, and it has two main sides. One is political, the other is economical. As you know, the south of Europe, especially Spain and Portugal, as well as Greece, is going through the deepest problems of the financial crisis in the European Union, and that means that public spending is being cut exponentially every year. To give you an idea, in 2008, when I was appointed director, we had a budget of 14 million euro, of which 2.5 million were generated, or 2 million were generated by our own activities was around income. Today we're struggling to keep the museum at 10 million euro with a small augmentation of our own income. So we made more money than before, but our budget has been severely cut. This is the economical change. The public institutions are pulling out of the cultural system as well as the public healthcare system and education, which is, compared with that, the cultural system to some, if not many, looks like pure decoration. But this is the reality we are in. What do we do in this context? In this context, we have to change tremendously the way we finance public culture, and I'll try to explain the role of the audience there because it's what will determine my contribution to this debate. Politically, what has been the change? The change has been that in 2011, all three public members of the consortium changed from social democrat to liberal. An artist named Peter Friedel prevents me from using ultra-liberal or neoliberal because there is liberal and the rest. But that means that the stakeholders of my institution have changed their criteria for judging the effects of the institution. And MACBA has an audience, yearly audience of about 350,000 visitors. But there is a trick in that. The trick is that more than 80% are tourists. So about between 16 and 18% of our audience are locals. And our current stakeholders identify that as a huge problem. Meaning the question is, our voters do not consider you important, although I'm spending a lot of money on you, so you have to do something. From a certain point of view, you would say we have a big problem. From our point of view, we say we have a great opportunity. And the result of this is that the audiences, whatever, local, international, etc., have to be at the source or the main solution to the financing problem. Not only because they pay an entrance fee, which is relatively symbolical, because there are many ways to make the museum nearly free, but also because if you want private patronage or sponsorship, you need larger audiences. You need bigger impacts on the public, on the receivers. And I think we come from a tradition. At least myself and many of our colleagues, first of all, that we access these institutions coming from the experience of curating. And for people of my generation, curating was working with artists. Zdenka said that before, and it's completely the same for me, and probably Bart would say the same. One of the biggest transformations we are operating, or we have to operate to arrive to this new situation, is to change the perspective of our institution from being product-oriented to being audience-oriented. Yet, we don't want, an institution like MACBA, under my directorship, I don't believe it has to become a mirror image of the strategies, of the programming strategies of other institutions, like, for instance, the Guggenheim Museum, which is clearly audience-driven. I think for a museum of our kind, which is in a social, cultural, and political context of a country without a state, or a nation without a state, as it was said before, our strategy is to be the voice or the instrument by which history is written and communicated and taught and disseminated from our specific perspective, with a very clear objective of making our culture exist within a global context. Internationalization is the only way, excuse me, internationalization is the only way small cultures or cultures in minority will exist within the global context. So, and in order to conclude and begin the discussion, I think these changes in the way the institutions address audience, address the product being the activities we do, and address our role within either the economy of the tourist economy, or the economy of experience, or the knowledge and education context, is a real big question with which we'll have to play to achieve these transformations that will lead us to the future or that will annihilate us.
I'm really happy that you spoke so harsh, and that in a certain way, because I do think that the question that's posed towards us, if we are serious being in institutions that are both economical operations and that do have an authority that is propelling them, and that we are in a kind of an ambiguous relation, and you ending, but may also clearly saying that an audience addresses our product, and that it's also a kind of an economical and even a survival necessity, and that's the terms in which we have to think in it. We are forced to think in it internally, which Jacques, you have also been interesting in saying that in Sharjah you were, the demand that was there was a demand for a window display. I think all of us are sort of related to that, and that we have to deal with this notion of audiences in very different ways. I think Mami has very beautifully doubled this in terms of resolving the financial capacity of an institution. On the one hand, a wealthy layer of people. On the other hand, the possibility of crowdfunding. I think there's also a very nice double nature between what Jacques has been saying of the kind of audience is connected to the question of what are the needs. And on the other hand, also what Kate has been bringing in from ICI, the professional audience as a real fact, but in a certain way that institutions are, in diverse ways, about producing an audience. So it's a kind of an operational question that has to negotiate with the managerial side, has to negotiate with the marketing people, has to negotiate with the kind of very basic thinking which authorities very often have. But so that was only the first part of our question, but which I think we have to pass through if we, in a real way, want to deal with it. Because the second part is like, do they, these audiences which we have been speaking about in the first half of the discussion, do they constitute a commons or a multitude? I would think that sometimes, in any case, if we speak within institutions, we don't approach this question as the first one, but sometimes we may nevertheless let it go to the fore. But then how do you do this in real terms? What have been moments when you said, yeah, now my audience to some extent did constitute a commons or a multitude? Really so. Yeah, we have all mics, perhaps we can each have them so that we don't. Yeah.
But I don't think the audience at this moment constitute the commons. I think it's an objective, but it's not yet there. The thing is that, be it or not be it, it's true that you have to produce the audience. The audience is not something natural. You have to add it, you have to build it. MACBA was opened its doors in 1995, and you have to remember that Spain was under a military dictatorship of, as old military dictatorships of fascist kind, between 1939 and 1975. So our modern history begins in, not modern, our contemporary history begins in 1980, which is pretty much when things start to move in the former Eastern, socially in the former Eastern countries. And the idea of community existed much stronger within the last years of the dictatorship until the, let's say, the mid-80s than now. I think it is also a question what we understand exactly by commons, but in my opinion the notion of community is very in question here.
I don't know you when you know, because Ravi spoke about this new opening. It's there. I see it there. For example, in what Sarah and Drax are doing, I see a very beautiful part of the time operation. When do we, as institutions, are for real a part of that? When do we offer that?
I mean, personally, I don't think we're even at the stage where an audience is either a commons or a multitude. I honestly don't think that we are at the stage where we listen and really let the audience, this kind of like in enough, because even just the production of an institution, you know, wherever we're doing it, is we're kind of focusing on producing something that we hope will be of interest to people. But I don't know that I've ever really, I mean, ICI, I've listened to the audience, but it's a professional audience. But I don't know how it can be either a commons or a multitude. I don't.
I just wanted to add something which maybe goes out of the way, but it's important in relation to the the link between the audience and the institution, and that is the role of the specialist. I think, and I can quote the situation in Holland, where recently in the parliament was stated that the relevant cultural productions were only those cultural productions which were acclaimed by a massive audience. Okay? Now this is very important, because this was in the Dutch parliament, and the Dutch are very special. I'm sorry, Charles Esche is not here today, because he could explain in more detail, but that means the role of the the specialist, the critic, or people like us, curators, have relatively no more role in this sphere, and that it is a question of managing and audience acclamation. So I think this is really happening now.
But there's again, regarding going back to the idea of the context of things, I think there's a cause here. So audience becomes part of the cause, and maybe referring to Bartolomeo's reference when you're addressing a stateless nation, and you're trying through, again, now I'm wearing my new hat, which is the kind of the Palestinian Museum, and kind of myself being put in charge of directing it. I'm also thinking about production, the production of knowledge, the reference to the history, and finally finding a voice that can express that and communicate that to your constituency first. And here the constituency is very much a multitude. It's not a in a case of a stateless nation, your constituency is dispersed throughout the world, and you're not talking to a kind of a defined geography. You're talking to people, refugees, communities who live in different parts of the world. And so if you're thinking about your constituency, you're thinking about a whole multitude of backgrounds and cultures, and beyond that, you're going through these communities to the rest of the world, trying to tell your story. So defining the audience in this case is at the core of your mission. It's a cause that you're carrying with you.
audience that it used to be the audiences are more like anonymous people. You don't see their faces. But now with the social media, that the people who has specific interest in contemporary art has a connection with the Facebook or Twitter, with the institutions. So that for institution now it's becoming a lot easier to attract, for instance, having like 150 seats lectures. And it's very easy to get the seats filled because of the new way of approaching to those specific audience. It's more clear that who they are, they have some needs for this kind of events. I'm sure all of you today knew this event through a website of UCCA, not like a letter that had been sent. So that also the limit, the certain generation that who uses every day these social media. So probably the your grandparents' generation wouldn't get that information that we are doing this kind of very interesting discussion today. And the other part is the idea of the audience, and then also your Spanish new policy, or Holland, their policy is about the majority. And it's based on the idea of democratization. The majority is better than minority. And but also this perception of the value of the art, also led by the specialists too. And it doesn't really naturally comes out that people start understanding that there is the needs of certain leadership or some guide for the audience to understand. So it's always a different relationship with the majority anonymous audience and the minority the specialist. How do you have a relationship?
Yes, but I think this is very important, but I think that there is no such thing as the audience. There are multiple minorities of audiences with very different interests that by one reason or the other get interested or get hooked up with what you do. But I agree with you, without the role of the specialist or the guide or whatever, the art production will be very irrelevant. We are not the movie industry. You know, in the plane I met a Chinese, I was sitting next to a Chinese lady who was talking about the art industry. And I said, wow, this is new. I mean, I know the art world, right? But I've never heard the art industry. And art is not an industry, it's a craftsmanship, you know? And we are craftsmen and craftwomen, but we are not industrial yet. The thing is, how can we use the knowledge generated by all of these techniques of communication and selling, why not call it like that, and so on, to benefit institutions which I believe they have a role, an important role beyond the numbers. But if we don't start taking care of the numbers, probably we will be replaced by people who will.
It's interesting though, because there's a dramatic shift, I think, that is happening, and it's the relationship of public institutions to private institutions. Because when you say, you know, will you be replaced, it's like the institution could be replaced.
Will be replaced by public politicians.
Right. I mean, it's just very different operating in China or in Russia, where there is no public that is going to be, and I think you have the similar situation, because I was listening to you, and what I've been charged with is to give voice to individuals. There's lots and lots of people that turn up, but in a private institution, I'm being asked to focus on a small number of people and to actually kind of make relevance through that. So it's not to make big numbers.
Yeah, it is true, and there would be, you know, that we would need a complete other panel to discuss about the notion of the public and the differences that we have in Europe or in China or in Palestine, Middle East, and so on, or even in South America or in the United States. But that's another panel, but it's a very crucial question.
Yeah.
I mean, your focus stems from the fact that you're working with a somehow state-controlled institution, which is completely different from where I'm coming. That's why I started, exactly, the state doesn't care and can't even get there. So that's why I said the context, again, is paramount and really kind of trying to read through this issue.
But there's one other, sorry. You said something very interesting, which is that the institution is the voice with which history is written. And I think about that in relation to audience. It's like, are we truly able to say that even if we want to get down to smaller or like minority audiences, is it really their voice that is even participating in writing this history? I can't personally say that there's ever been a kind of audience like that has actually kind of impacted on the writing of history.
But that is the question.
That's how you do it. You see, you need to come up with the programs and the ideas and the concepts for your exhibitions and, to basically integrate that. If your mission is to do that, then it's your duty to come up with the mechanisms and the ideas to do that. And I don't want to go into the explaining, some of the things that I'm trying to deal with now. But nevertheless, this is the responsibility that I think we're carrying.
How are you going to do it?
I'm trying to. Well, I mean, again, starting from the idea of the voice, the idea of the history, I proposed for the very first exhibition for the Palestinian Museum the idea of basically trying to represent Palestinian people, like take a snapshot of the Palestinian people, who, as I mentioned, are scattered all over the world. And so to do that is to try to kind of capture stories. And I thought of the idea of, which is not my original idea, I saw it somewhere else done differently, but I somehow adapted it, which is ask these people, different people from different walks of life, from different places, from different age groups, to give me this one thing that they've cherished, that they held on to for a long period of time, and to tell me why, what's the relationship between this object and themselves, what's the story that connects them with this object, and by doing that, I want to bring that particular object and that story to the exhibition. But that personal story tells about certain incidents that happens over a period of time, where particular historical things that connect to basically the bigger story about Palestine can be extracted from. And hence the connections amongst these different stories can be made with the general story about the history, about the unfolding of the conflict, etc. I think that is narrated and composed out of these ordinary stories, and its objects and its exhibits are made out of these very private and personal objects that the people carry with them. So in that sense, try to translate the whole idea of this place being the voice of the people by actually having the people themselves create the exhibition and create its content, and through that link to the bigger story about telling the history and conveying the knowledge about Palestine.
I think maybe we could look at the idea of a participatory art, which had been really popular in the last 20 years. That is partly came from the institutional side, that the necessity of involving more audience, the general public, and then also let them feel that they are also part of the process of art production, and then also the possibly chance to meet the artist, and then all of these further commitment to the work. It's not like audience and work, and then audience and the institution. There had been ways of blurring this boundary between the institution and audience, or the artwork and audience. So, but I like the fact that you said this personal history And the idea of historicization is not the singular way of drawing or writing the history. How you see the facts from collective view and the personal view, and then how you constantly rethink or rewrite whatever there is, the different, like evaluating whatever we have.
I'm just going to do a jibesh. I'm going to do a jibesh. It's like, what? Because there's another side to this, which is that in the production of an institution, in making an institution, I know damn well that in Russia, PR is one of the most important things to actually get people to come. Because if institutions don't exist beforehand that are full of contemporary art or this strange stuff, you have to find some way of dealing with things in a language, you know, of new media, of all this stuff that kind of relates to other parts of culture. So I can understand this woman calling art an art industry, because in her head, you know, contemporary art is big. There's like all these new institutions, like the Ulan Center and different places.
She was a PR professional.
There you go. But I think that there is a very strong importance with the fact that PR and kind of relating to how other industries kind of put themselves out there creates a kind of pride and an interest in going along to something because it looks like it's important.
But I think that's an interesting question. We know that our institutions, or an institution like MACBA, has a place within the tourist industry of the city. Barcelona, the great Barcelona, the metropolitan city, has about 3 million inhabitants, but the city receives 8 million tourists every year. So we all eat from tourism. The question is, and I think it is okay that tourism finances culture, but then you should as well make that institution live within the educational system, which will not give you money because essentially education is being privatized, and that means it's not a right anymore. So anyway, these are the changes we're living in our little small, tiny, minuscule cosmos, and called Europe, by the way. But it is a case study.
Yeah,
it is an interesting case study.
If we go here, we are in a very nice way representing Eurasia. Because all the four situations in which technically two are in Europe, because you are in the European part of Russia, and on the other hand, two are technically speaking Asia, because you are on the what we would, I think, parts of that world would not. Perhaps at this time, we have still a quarter of an hour, perhaps it's time to also open up to the floor, because we have been sort of trying to develop, I think, in the last part, micro possibilities, small possibilities about multiple minorities being hooked up, about giving a voice to individuals, but perhaps the floor can help us. Wise question.
Yes, I might ask a very cynical question. Forgive me for that. I don't want to delve into cynicism necessarily, but you sketched the dream on the one side and the reality on the other side. And when you were then talking about developing audiences, working together with audiences, kind of like representing the voice, I'm wondering whether a lot of what you were sketching was kind of like projecting a wishful thinking on a reality. I think if we, for example, here in China, I had these discussions with people like, what would people want you to show in your museum? And then they would say Damien Hirst or Maurizio Cattelan. And I think it might be pretty much the same in European context, that if you ask the audience, that you're not necessarily going to come into relational aesthetics, but that audiences will want to see blue chip art that bores us out of our systems, but that is absolutely a wish. And somehow there are other projects that kind of dealt with that. I remember the Picasso in Palestine thing. It's like, do we want to see our own objects coming out of our household with stories, or do we want to see this Picasso in this place where there is no Picasso? And I think that's somehow we need to also address that
I would do
You missed out
persons.
on one other thing, because you're talking about blue chip artists. I can also tell you that the pressure is also for a Palestinian museum to show folklore.
Kate, on our side of Europe, most close to Asia.
I mean, I think that's why I was talking about the fact that I'm not even sure that we're like an audience is a commons or a multitude. Because if we were to listen to what the audience right now wants, if we talk to like maybe 20 individuals, you know, are we going to do what they want? You know, because I've been thinking about that for a very long time, and I still believe that the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is that, you know, there needs to be a kind of balance. I don't believe in not bringing Damien Hirst into a situation, you know, and making a show like that. I think it's really important for everybody to have equal, like, chance to be able to experience and witness firsthand what this work is like. And so it's a case of, again, producing a program rather than ad hoc series of exhibitions, and know how you want to build the conversation.
I also think so that the institution needs to face with these constant challenges, with the different needs and demands, and then also the specialist necessity that we feel. So we are looking at the different faces. So we throw at different balls from the different sides. So it's a continuous exercise. It's not one-off thing. And we do show blockbuster show, but also the larger institutions like Tate and MoMA, they're also doing blockbuster show, but at the same time, they keep this project series more for the specific audiences. So we have to be also, the institution has to be also multi-faced and multi-layered with the way to access to different kinds of audiences and the larger or smaller specific groups.
Is this what you said in the beginning when you opened up this beautiful possibility of the entire universe having to be balanced and complemented and supplemented?
Yeah, I think the balance is really important. We're not really talking about who is audience and what is wrong or right, or which is yellow or white. But we should really need to think that all this balance is always moving. So there's no end, but we all need to be looking at the constant balance of each other. Whenever the society changes, whenever the condition of the politics changes, we have to be flexible enough to be able to respond to those changes.
But I think a good question could be, what does it mean talking to our audiences? What does it mean? How do you do that? And how do you integrate what the audience says in what you do as an institution? And I don't have an answer yet, but I think it is a relevant question.
For me, it was very inspiring shall I repeat? For me, it was very inspiring what Jack was talking before about different voices. So I would compare it to our idea in L'International about the oral histories, which we are engaged. At the moment, we only start thinking about it. For me, it's more like a metaphor, you know, like interview could be the metaphor. So you have two in the interviews. You have one who does the interview, the interviewer, and the one who is interviewed. And the question is how to keep the voice of the one who is interviewed undestroyed. You know, how to, with the other terminology, who are the narrators, how to keep their voices authentic. You know, for me, this is a basic question. For me, it's not enough to say only, yes, we need to have different voices represented. Exactly this represented is the problematic thing. We need to keep the voices as they are, and this maybe you can refer.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at a couple of examples of oral history, I thought that we needed to focus on a particular idea, and focus, in this case, on an object, and the relationship between that person and the object. From looking at oral history, the problem sometimes stems from the fact that it is so vast and so wide. So when when the curator or the editor comes in to kind of put it together, they need to interfere in order to kind of align them within a particular idea that he or she has. While the way I resolved it from the very beginning is to kind of really limit it to a story that talks about an object. Of course, in the back of my mind, I was also thinking about the museum and the idea of the object, and how would the audience look at this museum and what it represents in terms of objects. But the story in itself, through the narrator, is very important, because what we're trying to do is find the facts and the ideas that can be picked up in this particular personal story and connect it to the general story, and connect these different people who come, as I said, from completely different backgrounds, and who have, who have been over the past 65 years. Now we have third-generation Palestinians who do not even speak Arabic, and who were born and raised in somewhere that is, that's completely disconnected from Palestine, to try to reconnect them back to that mother idea. So just by doing this very specific focus with the narrator about a particular object, about a particular idea.
I think you bring in a very important offer to this conversation, because you make clear that audience, we have always been speaking about it in a kind of a here and now, in a kind of contemporaneity, while there's this very beautiful idea from American political thinking that the citizens are all the people that ever lived, all the people that live now, and all the people that will live. And I think in a certain way, in echo of what was discussed in the first panel, that in a certain way history and the reactivation of history can also be seen perhaps as part of a kind of an active audience. Yeah.
It's very interesting, because going, if I can maybe anticipate what you're going to say right now, I think what it shows is that two trends. One is in the West, where you had a public, you had a notion of the public. The notion of the public is now being, made into an audience with attendant monetization, the intimation of industrial forms. You had it in cinema. You always had it in cinema, where the public were always overlapped with some notion of monetization. It is a whole collapse of the welfare state, and the transition that you're going to undertake. In other contexts, the public is being produced and intimated in this kind of intimation of the future, in whatever way, in this kind of fragile thing. And in your case, it's trying to map this transitory flow, which is a mass, but you're trying to actually deal with this high transitory flow. So it's very productive divergences, some tragic, because the public now becomes an audience with all kinds of banshees, if you like, of money. And in other contexts, I think publics, you have to intervene. And that's where I find this productive intervention very, very important. And that will continue. These parallel tracks, I think, will continue.
Yeah, I think the kind of audiences are always changing, as you said. And as I began this discussion that Mori Museum just had a 10th anniversary, that now I'm starting to meet the younger audience who saw the first show when they were in high school, and then some of them decided to be an artist, or I saw one of your show in earlier time and then wanted to become a curator, things like this. So I think even in 10 years, the group of audience really changes, and then you are doing something for certain people.
I mean, this is all extremely interesting in the context of where we are today, and I really appreciate especially what Ravi just said about the idea of the public as an intimation of a possible future. In our sort of statement and mission, we refer to this idea of a global Beijing public, which of course is one that is not nationally articulated, and that understands this as a world city, which is not necessarily the most interesting thing to say. The more interesting thing is maybe to think about what it means here to be a place that's neither commercial nor governmental, and that in a context like this, a public institution where politics is decidedly not participatory, a place could be public without being for the actual people, and then it becomes a bit of a self-selecting question, but who do you attract through your programming? What do they take from it? And how do you use the platform of the institution to either write an art history or influence lives in a way that's kind of consistent with some larger narrative that's maybe agreed upon by many other parties, albeit constantly in flux of kind of, in our particular case, what is contemporary art in a Chinese context? What is Chinese contemporary art, for lack of a better term? How does that intersect with things from above and beyond? But also, how does this as a place become somewhere that a city can feel ownership of and belonging to and pride in? And in a way, it's maybe a kind of quaint idea of the museum in a more traditional Western sense, but of course in the translation and in the actualization, it undergoes infinite kinds of changes to the point where you're actually, to use Deng Xiaoping's phrase, crossing the river by feeling the stones and ending up with a reality that is both a reflection of its underlying conditions, but also a sublimation of those at the same time.
It's very nice to have the place respond. Thank you.
It's a story Eric Foxman used to say. It is about his friend or himself, I don't know. Is that he went, there were these workers' education classes, so he went there to give a lecture, and he started by saying, oh, you must be hardworking, you have great experience, great knowledge, you have such depth, and I am just a very small person standing in front of you. And this guy stands up, a very old worker, stands up and says, then why did you come here to speak if you have nothing to offer? Yes. So the idea is that there is this two notions of culture that I think operates. One is this kind of a passive idea of delivery culture, which television has mastered, I think which is now part of the art fair discourse a lot. You have to produce great delivery systems, and people will flock in. Like in Delhi Art Fair, you have 150,000 people flocking in 3 days. But there is this other idea of culture, which this example I was saying, it's a kind of threshold challenging idea of culture where we're kind of challenging the threshold points. Like what would this site need in today's world to be like classic with Barcelona, with 80% is international tourists, it can produce a completely different site for a knowledge production. I'm just, this debate of the audience, can we resituate it within this idea that the audience also is a person who can ask of you, what is the threshold that you are posing? Maybe, why are you thinking of me as such a passive form? And Web 2 clearly shows that in a huge way the world has produced an enormous amount of content, and which is not exactly in the earlier cultural model. So I'm just curious how, like the last 10 years, if you look at the kind of cultural content that has been produced all over the world in the Web 2, you can see that a completely different definition of the world has emerged. And like most of the information about India, which I carry is from the Web 2. I don't go to a television or a newspaper. And it's not me only. I'm talking here of a huge, I'm talking about millions actually. So I'm just curious whether that can be brought back to a discussion and maybe reimagined back into a way museum operates itself.
It's very interesting because on the one hand you've got that, why are we thinking of you as such a passive entity as audience? And then on the flip side you have what Mami was talking about, which is participatory art, that for a decade kind of insisted on engagement in a certain way, under certain terms, and then that was given as like the audience being involved and engaged. And I think that there's something else that's kind of in between that is incredibly difficult, because what it actually means is one-on-one conversations or looking at the singularities. And when you start to think like that in relation to, you know, say the problems that you're having, it's like, how do you engage with the kind of individual, to get rid of passive kind of thinking, you have to engage with individuals. And how do you do that when you need an audience that is larger than
I think it relates to what Colin said at the beginning as the counterbalance between art market and something else. And I think what museum or institution could still offer is this invisible experience. It's not the products. It's not something that you could visualize, but you offer the experience of going through this the space in the art exhibition, which is, I think, is very important, and how you look at, how you encounter with the particular work, and it's different from in the way that how you present those. And it relates to the tourism too. You're just offering the experience to the people who come from outside. And I think you should really proud that 80% of your audience is a tourist. That is the reason that you should be there, to offer something special.
You should talk to the politicians in Barcelona. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I was actually putting this topic together, and I was actually had selfish motives, because at the moment I'm developing a new contemporary art institution in Wuhan, which is a country it's a city with 10 million inhabitants, almost. And very, very little capacity for contemporary art engagement. So when you're spending a lot of money and putting together an institution, you're in a vast city with lots and lots of people, but very little capacity for contemporary communication. Who is your audience, and what kind of programming do you do? And that actually reminds me of like what Jibesh said, is that, well, actually the audience isn't necessarily on your doorstep. And this was a very important part of the way that I'm envisioning what is that, well, the idea of the terminus is that it's not fixed. We can't be fixed in just one location. We actually have to do things like the Multitude Art Prize. We have to communicate like this, but with exhibitions as well. So the idea was to have a smaller institution, have less budget spent on necessarily all the exhibitions there, and let's say reserve a lot more resources on actually communicating with the rest of the world.
No, I agree that you have to create the audience. Until the early 80s, in the Spanish context, there were no museums of contemporary art. We are very young, but you still have to create it. It's possible.
From nothing to 300,000 plus.
My question is responding to something that Bart said, which I think is really interesting. This idea that citizens are not just of the past, but also of the future. And as museums, you have an opportunity to think, because you're in a sense custodians not only of the present but also of the future, because museums have a footprint in time that's much longer than other institutions. And in terms of expectation, just as you are under pressure of the expectations of the audiences of the present, but you can also put some pressure on the audiences of the future, in a sense that you are, in a sense, and it's incipiently coming out in a lot of what you're saying, that you're thinking about the future, but what are the ways in which thinking about the future, let's say, and I'm not talking about 10 years, I'm talking about 50 years from now, 100 years from now, because museums can have that kind of temporal footprint. What are your expectations about, and how are you planning for the next 100 years?
We just this month published a book with Valis Publishers in the Netherlands, which was initiated by the Appel in Amsterdam, by Witte de Wit in Rotterdam, and by Muka in Antwerp. It has a title, Institutional Attitudes. It's a continuation. It's like questioning what may be the sense of an institution. We started with a conference 4 years ago. Now there's this book, and we reformulate in a way which for me is very clear, which is, it becomes a question of verticality. Is there still a possibility of verticality today in a world that became increasingly horizontal, and in which we can even say that the neoliberal utopia and the Occupy are in a certain way, that's what Mark Fisher is stating in one of the articles, are two versions of the same ideology. And I think that's in a certain way the challenge of institutions at this moment. And I think it's really nice that the place for which we are speaking in two ways for me responded to that in a clear way. I mean, the question which, to my understanding, has to be asked again is about duration. It's about longevity, and that may be one of the challenges that institutions are facing. And if I, to round up this moment, because we are already, I think, 3.5 minutes in delay, more or less, we were asked here to speak about the relation between audiences and our dreamlike notions, which we have been loving to use as commons and multitude. But the question to go forth from, maybe the one that was asked by the UCCA, how do we use the platform? And in which there was the addition, which I think Colin then has underlined, consistent with other partners. So in a certain way, the key element of our institutionality and even of our notion of audience may become this consistent with other partners. I would like to, because I think it's good that we stay a bit, it's always nice to stay on the schedule so that we have enough time to speak also informally outside of this kind of block-like thing, even if I was happy that, thank you for being in a real conversation here. So I would like to round up now so that we can continue in the break, which is the nicest moment right now.